Okay, folks. Oh, there is a higher turnout than usual. Excellent. I'm sure that has everything to do with our excellent first speaker of the semester this year. I can't help but wonder, though, if in part it has to do with the wonderful fireside chat that we all got from our new Ecology Center director. I'm looking forward to more of those in the future. All right. It's my great pleasure to introduce this month's Ecology Center seminar speaker and my collaborator, Dr. William Anderegg. Dr. Anderegg is an associate professor in the School of Biological Sciences just down the road at University of Utah, where he is the director of the Wilkes Center for Climate Science and Policy. He joined the faculty at the University of Utah in 2015, while simultaneously serving as an associate research scholar at the Princeton Environmental Institute until 2016. Before that, he was a NOAA Climate and Global Change postdoctoral fellow at Princeton. Dr. Anderegg earned his BA in human biology and a PhD in biology from Stanford University. He has been recognized by the National Science Foundation's Alan T. Waterman Award, the National Science Foundation Faculty Development Early Career Science Program, the Lotnick Foundation National Laureate in Life Science, Web of Science Global Highly Cited Researcher, Packard Foundation Fellow for Science and Engineering, and as an Early Career Fellow of the Ecological Society of America. Dr. Anderegg's research encompasses the intersection of ecosystems and climate change, where he studies how drought and climate change affect forested systems, including tree physiology, species interaction, carbon cycling, and nature-based climate solutions. Dr. Anderegg's research program spans a huge array of scales from xylem cells to ecosystems and seeks to gain a better understanding of how climate change will affect forests and society in the Western U.S. and around the world. Please join me in welcoming Dr.
Well, thank you, Justin. Can folks hear me out there? It sounds fine. Okay, fantastic. First of all, huge thank you for the invitation to come interact and chat and discuss science with all of you, share some of the work that my group has been doing in the past couple of years. It's a pleasure to be here. Glad to see there's lots of snow that arrived around the same time. What I want to do today is I'm going to tell kind of two main science stories. First, just a quick background, setting the context for some of the challenges our forests face this century. And then I'm going to tell one of our recent stories around the scaling of physiology from tissues up to larger scales and how there are these whole sets of processes that can mediate that scaling. And then I'm going to switch, jump topics a little bit into a newer vein of research we've been working on how we can bring a lot of this ecological research to bear to inform nature-based solutions, nature-based climate solutions in forests. So of course, the context here on our blue-green marble floating in space is that we are performing a massive, unreplicated, largely unprecedented experiment on the climate through our emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, Earth's forests in particular have these immense benefits. They support the vast majority of terrestrial biodiversity. They play key roles in global carbon, water, and energy cycles, and they provide immense benefits to communities through goods, services, timber, tourism, fuel, and others. When we think about climate change, this is from the top of one of NASA's LBA towers in the Amazon at dawn. And we spent the night up there as part of a field course, and it's just amazing to actually look out at the Amazon and kind of be confronted by the vastness of these forests. Earth's forests are really perched on this knife edge between two opposing broad sets of forces. On one hand, rising CO2 concentrations can benefit plants, let them do more photosynthesis, potentially grow more, and continue to serve as this really large carbon sink. Earth's forests currently take up about a quarter of the CO2 that humans put up into the air every year. But on the flip side, on the other hand, the stresses of climate change, temperature, droughts, wildfires, pests and pathogens can overwhelm the benefits of CO2, drive widespread forest mortality, and lead forests to become carbon sources in certain regions. This is a picture here on the right from Colorado. So this is a spruce beetle outbreak moving through Colorado near our field sites. And in many of these disturbances, you see huge losses of biomass. And we estimate that you are seeing these transition to a carbon source in these systems. And so the question of when and where will these different forces dominate and what do we expect for the future of forests has really been top of mind for a lot of folks. And it matters for the future of the atmosphere itself. So this is a really nice summation of some of our recent Earth system models. And what you can see, this is the total land change in carbon storage from around 2010 over the 21st century in a high emission scenario in red and a low emission scenario in blue. And you can see that in both of these scenarios, the range of the change in land carbon storage is massive. This is not, of course, all forests, but it's largely dominated by forests. And in some of these areas, in some of these model runs and scenarios, we end up with 250 petagrams of carbon more or carbon losses on the other end of this spectrum. And which of these, where along this spectrum are we likely to head with the land carbon sink is a really critical issue for the speed of climate change, that the difference between the high and the low end in these scenarios can be up to 200 parts per million in the atmosphere, as large as the ballpark range for some of our climate scenario differences. This, as we're quite familiar with here in the West, is no longer hypothetical and is no longer restricted to models. That we see these climate impacts playing out around us every summer in the West. And in fact, I think it's my experience has been it's hard to drive any sort of mountain pass in the West these days and not see the impacts of climate change playing out on forests. Whether it's fires or beetles or drought stress, we are seeing these in our own backyard already. So what my group tries to do is really tackle three kind of interrelated questions. The first is, how can we improve our predictions of individual tree responses using some of these first principles and the mechanistic relationships in plant physiology and in ecology? Second, how can we scale that from individual trees up to ecosystems and ultimately continents and the globe? And then third, this more recent vein in our research, how can we leverage and use this data and these models and this scientific understanding to inform decision makers? In some cases, this might be more regional decision makers around forest management, for example. And in some cases, this might be national or international decision makers around climate policy, carbon markets, carbon offsets, and nature-based climate solutions. So I see what my group does is kind of in these broad three categories of the ecophysiology of plant climate responses at often sort of tissue, cell to tissue level scales, scaling of that from tissues up to ecosystems. This often uses large data sets and models. And then finally, using this to inform nature-based climate solutions, which is a lot of tool development and development of maps and engagement and interaction with decision makers. So to give you now kind of two flavors, I wish I had time to talk about a bunch of different projects. And in particular, I'm not going to talk as much about this first group, this first section in our lab. I'm going to tell you a story of recent work on the scaling and two recent studies on this nature-based solutions work we're doing. So to the first science story I want to tell you, one of the key ways that we try to quantify variation in how plants respond to climate is using functional traits. I'm sure all of you are probably quite familiar with functional traits. Here's the fairly standard definition. And there's this immense growth in databases and public open science around what these functional traits and the measurements that we have. This is a word cloud of some of the most common functional traits. These are things like the specific leaf area or how flat and broad are leaves compared to their mass. Another very common one in wood is the wood density or specific gravity. And so we have these immense set of functional traits that we use to categorize, that we measure, and then use to understand strategies. We work a lot on water transport and how plants respond to drought stress along this hydraulic continuum from the soil to the atmosphere. And this is all under tension, right? Plants are pulling water from the soil up to leaves, and eventually it's evaporated to the atmosphere. And the key functional traits that we tend to think about here have to do with when this system breaks down during stress. So during extreme levels of stress, as these tensions rise higher and higher, or these are negative water potentials, so the water potentials fall more and more negative, these water columns start to snap and you get embolism shoot in. This is an example of an embolism here in a leaf. And we tend to quantify this with this sort of sigmoidal curve, often called a vulnerability curve. And the idea here is that as you go from wetter to drier conditions, you lose the ability, any given tissue of a plant loses the ability to pipe water due to this process of embolism. Different tissues, different species, different populations often differ in their ability and how vulnerable they are to embolism. And we tend to quantify this often with looking at the midpoint of this sigmoidal curve. It's often called the P50. It's the water potential at which 50% of the hydraulic conductivity is lost. So that's one functional trait that I'll be talking about. Another really important functional trait is called the hydraulic safety margin. And that's a measurement of how close on an average season do you tend to get to this P50 point? How close do you get to falling off this cliff in water stress? And we've shown in previous work with flux towers that these two traits actually are important in some of the variation in fluxes across temperate and boreal forest sites. So these are a couple functional traits I'll come back to. Now, these functional traits are interesting, but we actually, in order to understand broader behavior, have to place them in a category of trade-offs, that no single species can be excellent at everything. And I think the kind of one of the most common frameworks we tend to place this in is often this fast, slow plant economics spectrum. And the idea here, this is a bunch of functional traits, both in leaves and in roots. But the idea here is that we use these traits to place species on a spectrum of strategies, going from more acquisitive species that have really faster resource acquisition or uptake, probably at the cost of being much worse during stressful conditions. And at the other end of the spectrum, we have much more conservative species that are much slower at resource uptake, but we think should be better at tolerating stress and surviving. This is there's been, I just listed some example papers down here, but there have been hundreds, maybe thousands of papers in this area in the past 20 years. It's been a really fruitful area, I would say. But there are a huge number of unknowns in this. And one of the key unknowns, this is from a nice paper by Peter Reich in 2014, one of the key unknowns has to do with scaling, that we measure almost all of these traits at a tissue level. But what we care about is often processes at a much bigger scale. We care about demographic rates, and we care about fluxes, ecosystem fluxes. And so how these traits actually scale to an organism, to a community, and to an ecosystem scale is a lot harder challenge to figure out. And there's a lot more unknowns in this scaling. This framework is actually posing a bunch of different hypotheses. These are what all these H's are, and highlighting a lot of unknowns here. Why it's set up as sort of a weird spider web, that I don't know. But anyway, this is moving up in scale along here towards this axis. So what we wanted to try to tackle with this work, we had, our questions were, specifically within forests, where we had good functional trait coverage of the community, how does this conservative acquisitive trade-off scale from individual species to communities to ecosystems? And we're really thinking a lot about drought performance here. So what we're going to be looking at is the maximum fluxes and then the responses of fluxes to atmospheric drought stress, here vapor pressure deficit. And we wanted to know, which of these plant functional traits actually seem to matter at larger scales in the system response. And then finally, we had this hypothesis that actually, as you move up in scales, the effective traits might weaken, in part due to a number of these community assembly processes that give you species diversity or trait diversity. So our question was here, as you move up in scales, do you see this conservative acquisitive trade-off weaken, potentially due to these other community dynamics? And I'll walk you through how we tried to test that. So what did we do? So we went to these large databases and collated the functional traits for the species in the footprints of sap flux studies and of flux tower data sets. So then we're using two multi-biome data sets of sap fluxnet, which is this compilation of sap flux from trees around the world. That's our community level, is where we have good coverage of sap flux within a given forest community. And then FluxNet are these eddy covariance towers where we have carbon and water fluxes. We test for this trade-off at these three different scales, at a species scale and community scale in sap flow. Since we have measurements of individual trees, we can look at both individual tree responses and the community response. And then the ecosystem is capturing all the plants in that footprint of the eddy covariance tower. And then we'll do some just fairly simple correlations about which of these traits are correlated with community and ecosystem level flux responses. Now, just quickly on the traits, we're looking here at the community weighted mean and standard deviation. These are not traits, but in simple site factors like species richness, number of species, and the fraction that is gymnosperm in the community. And then some of our standard traits. So the wood density, which is really capturing these, I'd say correlated with proxies of drought and shade tolerance. Specific leaf area, which is this very common resource acquisition trait. Maximum photosynthetic rate, maybe even a little more directly linked to resource acquisition. Xylem vulnerability to embolism, that 50% loss of conductivity, and hydraulic safety margin. So these are the traits that we were looking at. Here is our coverage in climate space of our sites. So gray is showing you SAP FluxNet and blue is FluxNet 2015. And we have decent coverage, I would say, in temperate and boreal zones, and very little coverage in wetter, some of the wetter forest sites. That's due both to that there aren't many flux towers in the tropics, and also that there aren't enough functional traits to actually have community weighted means and cover enough of the community in those sites. So anyway, we have about 160 sap flux sites and about 40 flux tower sites. How we look at these two different dimensions of a trade-off for acquisitiveness, this one I think is a lot more straightforward. We're looking at the 90th percentile of daily water fluxes. So this is either sap flow or latent energy flux at the flux towers, where we're restricting it to periods where it's largely dominated by transpiration. Now, quantifying the stress tolerance, or here I'm phrasing it as the drought sensitivity using flux data, is a lot harder to convince yourself what a good metric or what the right metric ought to be. We tried many, many different metrics, and ultimately we settled on this one that comes from the ecophysiology literature. It's a very common metric in the stomatal conductance and stomatal response literature. This is the coefficient of regression between canopy conductance and VPD. And the way that I think about this is, how rapidly do plants tend to close their stomata as the atmosphere gets drier, as VPD goes up? There's reasons from the literature why this is a nice measurement, but these are the two metrics we've chosen to look at. And then what we would predict given these two metrics is that this trade-off should look something like this, that if you have maximum flux on the y-axis here from more conservative to more acquisitive species, And in the units of our conductance sensitivity, you get more sensitive towards 0 and more insensitive here. So we'd expect this strong negative relationship. And in terms of scaling, we're going to do this at all 3 scales. I'm going to show you this plot at an individual species scale, a community scale, and an ecosystem scale. And if there is a trade-off at all scales, we'll expect this negative relationship at each. So what do we actually see? Same graph, maximum fluxes on the y-axis, conductance sensitivities on the x-axis. And I've colored this now where blue circles are angiosperm species or angiosperm-dominated sites, and red circles are gymnosperm species or gymnosperm-dominated sites. We see, consistent with both the huge tissue level literature and some literature at individual level responses, there is a really pretty strong trade-off at the species level. This weakens somewhat. You can see the change here in R squared. It weakens somewhat at the community level, and it largely disappears at the ecosystem level. There is still a relationship in gymnosperm-dominated sites, but not in angiosperm-dominated sites and not in the overall relationship, which is in black here. Now, which traits tend to matter? So this is just for each trait, the regression between that trait and either the flux maximum here or the flux sensitivity here. There's a lot of traits listed here, but the key things that I want to highlight are hydraulic traits are in dark red. The more classic leaf economic spectrum traits are in light red, and then these site factors are in gray. And a couple things to highlight are that in general, hydraulic traits tend to be much more strongly correlated with ecosystem and community fluxes. And that it's kind of different combinations of traits that are associated with the flux maximums and flux sensitivity, although there are some common traits like this P50 mean that are correlated with both. If we do a couple just quick bivariate plots, hopefully I can convince you a lot of these trait flux relationships make a ton of sense physiologically. So here, this is the P50, that water potential at which you lose conductivity. And as you move towards more negative water potentials, that's more drought tolerant species, indeed, the maximum fluxes at a community and at an ecosystem scale both decline. So that tells us that you can't be both incredibly drought tolerant from a trait perspective and support incredibly high water fluxes. That makes complete sense based on our physiological understanding of xylem transport. And then the final piece that we tested is back in this model, we then put traits in as covariates. And we asked, okay, does understanding the mean or the diversity of traits actually improve our ability to model this trade-off? And one of the interesting things we found, this is really trying to get at how much do traits, and in particular, things like the diversity of species or traits, decouple this relationship, say at these high scales. And one of the things that we found was that in particular, species richness and also a few of these other functional traits actually dramatically improved those statistical models. And this was true at both a community and an ecosystem level. We saw a lot stronger trait effects at the community level compared to the ecosystem level. And I think this is maybe nice preliminary evidence that it seems like these community assembly processes are at least playing some role in mediating or explaining the variance in this trade-off across these sites. So just to wrap up this piece, the main conclusions we found were that we saw this incredibly broad trade-off at a species scale, but it largely disappears by the time you get up to an ecosystem. That you see different traits underpinning the maximum fluxes as opposed to the VPD sensitivities. That at least there's some evidence that species diversity and some of these functional trait diversity metrics seem to at least partially decouple these trade-offs as you move up in scale. And it's worth emphasizing this is trying to pull together a lot of different data sets from a lot of different sites. And so there are a number of caveats here, both uncertainties in the sap flux data and eddy covariance data, using species mean traits here. We don't have much tropical forest coverage, so we think of this as kind of a temperate and boreal analysis. And then things like boundary layer and the flux towers, there's a lot of considerations there. Happy to talk about these in questions if folks want to know. So now I'm going to pivot and jump to a slightly different section of our research on the science for nature-based climate solutions in forests. You've probably been hearing about some of these quite broadly. There's a large and growing interest in this. Generally, when we talk about nature-based climate solutions, it's a pretty broad set of strategies, but these are kind of the top 5 that people tend to research in forests. First and foremost is not cutting down forests to begin with, avoided deforestation. Reforestation or afforestation, this is a lot of this tree planting that I'm sure you've heard in the media. And then another incredibly broad one within carbon markets is this term of improved forest management, which is basically some sort of management change to store more carbon on the landscape. Often it's through extending harvest intervals, sometimes through setting aside sections of timberland. And then, of course, improved plantations and agroforestry also are within this mix. In terms of amount of interest in this, these top 3 have been the biggest focus of science and, I would say, policy in the past couple of years. And of course, there's lots of reasons why it's awesome to have more forests and why, if we can pull this off effectively, they could have immense co-benefits for biodiversity, for ecosystem services, and just for conservation broadly. I think for these reasons, there's been this huge and growing interest from governments to large-scale multinational corporations in nature-based solutions in forests. Now, these so far have been largely funded by carbon offsets in carbon markets. And that presents a really interesting set of challenges because it's trading forest growth for continued fossil fuel emissions. Potentially moral challenges with that, but focusing it particularly on the biophysical challenges, what we really have to do if forests are going to deliver as climate solutions is they need to hit at least 4 key criteria. First and foremost, well, actually, these are all equally important, I would say. This is just the order I put them in. First, they have to cool the climate on net, which means we have to think about the biophysical feedbacks like albedo that can actually change the net effect on climate. There are plenty of areas, particularly in snow-dominated and arid regions, where if you went out and you plant a bunch of really dark conifer trees, you will on net heat up the climate because those effects are larger than the CO2 storage effects. Second, they have to lead to additional carbon storage than what would have happened otherwise. This is basically saying you don't get to just take credit for what was going to happen anyway because you haven't changed anything. You have to change what was going to happen otherwise. Third, you have to account for shifting activities. This is the technical term is leakage on this. And that means if I protect a forest here and then it's just cut down over here, I haven't done much for the climate, right? You have to account for the shifting both directly of activities and the market signals of changing timber prices. And then finally, you have to think about how long the forest can survive. Fossil fuel emissions stay in the atmosphere hundreds to thousands of years. So if we're going to let fossil fuel emissions keep going and store more carbon in a given forest, and that forest goes up in flames in 5 or 10 years, we've really weakened and undermined our climate policy. So understanding what these risks are, this is often called permanence or durability, what these risks are to forests is paramount in ensuring that they actually succeed in their climate mitigation goals. So what are these risks? This is something we've been working on a lot. I think they're often subdivided into more ecological risks. Sometimes in carbon market terms, they're called natural risks, although they're not really natural, and more human system risks. So On the ecological risk side, this is a lot of things we were just talking about: fire, drought, even slower changes like compositional shifts or invasive species, and really any and all disturbances that could cause you to lose carbon. On the human system side, this is a pretty large set, but you might think of this as financial failure, management failure, policy and governance changes. If a different president comes in Brazil and suddenly the Amazon's getting cut down, that is a potential risk to a lot of these projects. And so these are the types of risks we have to think about. And the challenge here, this is, I think, a critical test for the broad field, is in order to inform policy, policymakers would like to know the integrated 100-year risk of all of these. What are the odds that you are going to have a fire or a biotic agent outbreak in any given forest over 100 years? This is an immense challenge. And we think that we can do a lot better than is happening now in all of these carbon policies, which the amount of science going into them is scarily bad and absent. So there's a lot better that can be done, but ultimately, can we get towards some sort of confidence in these integrated risks? 100 years is often the time horizon that people look at for this durability, that if we can estimate the risks over 100 years, maybe that's close enough to the fossil fuel residence time. So I want to tell you about two projects here. In the first, we wanted to ask these questions of, for US forests in particular, what are some of the largest risks and how do they vary in space? How do these risks then affect the projections of forest carbon? And I think maybe a more interesting scientific question is, do different methods of projecting carbon give similar or different answers about the future of US forests? So what we did in this first project was try to model some of the key climate disturbances in US forests. So here we're looking at wildfire. Climate stress is what we term this, but this is predominantly drought impacts, and insect impacts from stand structure, functional traits, and climate variables. What are some of the historical patterns? And then if we make future projections with these statistical models, what do we see? For fire, we built this fairly standard statistical model with John Abatsoglu using Landsat MTBS data. For climate stress and insects, this is from the FIA data set. And we ran this at every single FIA plot, but basically we're modeling mortality from these two at a forest type level based on 6 different climate predictors: forest age, and this key functional trait of P50 that we developed in a previous study. We downscaled a number of Earth system models to 4 kilometers and then ran all these models into the future at a 4-kilometer spatial resolution for 3 different climate scenarios, a kind of low to moderate all the way up to very high climate scenario. And then for all of these, we did future projections only where we felt like the cross-validated performance of the historical models was reasonably high. So we did an immense amount of cross-validation and validation against independent data sets to convince ourselves that we had reasonable and rigorous statistical models. Here is what our models look like. So here, this is observed burn, top is burn area, drought-related mortality, and insect-related mortality. These left columns are MTBS or FIA, so this is observed, and these right columns are our models. So this is our modeled burn area and our modeled mortality. I want to highlight Wyoming is this gap in FIA without resurveys in our FIA data yet that we had. This is FIA data through 2018. So Wyoming is a gap in observed, but there are trees dying there. We just don't have them yet in this FIA data set. So that's just something to mention. None of these spatial patterns are terribly surprising, right? Fires are burning most in the west. We see a lot of drought impacts in the Intermountain West. And in terms of insect impacts, really the Rockies and parts of California and up into Oregon and Washington light up. Here's what our cross-validated performance looks like. So our cross-validated performance in fire is, I think, pretty strong. It's a lot harder to model drought-driven tree mortality and insect-driven tree mortality. This is our cross-validated performance there. And then we actually, on insects, compared to the aerial detection surveys as well as an independent data set, and we're able to reproduce that fairly well also. Lots of covariation in the drought and insect mortality for both data set reasons and I think ecological reasons. So looking forward into the future, this is breaking it out by different regions. Not surprisingly, fires are projected to increase quite substantially, particularly in parts of the Western US. Here's the Southwest or California, for example. These are the three different climate scenarios. So red is a high emission scenario and green is much lower emissions. Climate stress-driven mortality or drought mortality really ramped up throughout the Southwest and a little bit in California. And as you might expect, was much, much lower in the Pacific Northwest or the Southeast. And insect mortality had the biggest signal in a lot of these sort of California regions. Happy to go into why that is, but I'll save that for questions. So a couple caveats to this work. Of course, these are empirical models, and we're looking forward into the future. And so there is some out of sample projections. And then there's a huge number of processes that, of course, we're not capturing in these statistical models. We're not able to capture feedbacks in fuel and fuel limitations, land management, disturbance interactions. There's a large number of things that we can't capture in these statistical models right now. I think there's a lot of reasons why these projections may be overestimates or underestimates. And if I had to guess, actually, I think the fire is maybe likely to be slightly on the high side, and the insects and drought are likely to be substantially on the low side. I think our insects and drought models are probably underestimates of the full risk. And with the goal of making all of this useful to decision makers, we partnered with a nonprofit called Carbon Plan to make all this data and code publicly available and also build a really nice web tool where you can fly around the West, you can fly around anywhere in the US, click on any decade, any risk, and look at what these models indicate. And then you can download the data yourself. What we then wanted to know is, let's scale this up to carbon. So all of these are disturbance risks. Now let's get this to carbon, which is the ultimate unit that these nature-based solutions are trying to go for. This is work led by a postdoc in my group, Chao Wu. So what Chao did, and what we did in this project, is try to compare these three broad methods of how do we think about the future of carbon in US forests. First, we use these mechanistic vegetation models. These come out of these Earth system models in the CMIP6 archive, and we can look at the carbon in vegetation. The second is we built these demographic models that are basically stand growth curves and then a stochastic disturbance probability. This is somewhat similar to the FVS, Forest Vegetation Simulator type approach, but instead of management, we have a stochastic chance of a fire or a drought or an insect outbreak happening. That came from those previous models I just showed you. And then finally, we brought in this niche modeling approach, which is this immense conservation tool of these large-scale correlations between climate variables and biomass. And so we built these models of all vegetation carbon and then carbon in 24 forest groups. And for fun, we'll go ahead and throw on the forest offset projects from California in California's cap and trade system on these future maps. So, simple question here. Across these different methods, do we think the future of US forests is more carbon or less carbon? And the answer is it depends fundamentally on the method. In the Earth system models, you can see carbon gain is ubiquitous. It's everywhere except a tiny patch in Texas. We don't really understand what's going on in Texas, so don't ask me. And you can see, forest area averaged, it's about a 45% increase in carbon. This is in a moderate emissions scenario, and it's the difference between the end of century and today. So about a 45% increase in above ground live carbon. If you look at the niche models, on the other hand, you see carbon losses in huge swaths and kind of strange swaths of the US, so the Pacific Northwest and this kind of mid-Atlantic region. And on net, it's a carbon loss of about 4% across the US. I should have mentioned every single one of these numbers gets bigger in the high emission scenario. So you lose more carbon in a high emission scenario and you gain more carbon in a high emission scenario in your system models. And then finally, in the demographic model, the one that I think I would probably put the most stock in if I had to pick one, you tend to see modest carbon gains in the east and the Pacific Northwest, and then carbon losses throughout the Intermountain West and California. And it's just a slight increase overall in terms of above ground live carbon. You can average these. Maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not. But one of the things we did in an average is you can put hashing of where all three methods agree in the sign of the change. No methods agree in the sign of losses, but you can see these hatching areas are where all three methods agree that there's likely to be an increase in carbon by the end of the century. So I'm going to come back and show you in particular, well, actually, this is all three of these maps. These are the current forest offset projects in California's cap and trade. These are the three maps of the changes in carbon. I should mention, Chow did a whole bunch of further analyses about what's driving a lot of this uncertainty, and a lot of it comes down to precipitation, and and to a lesser extent, changes in fire. What do these offset projects show? Well, in particular, I want to zoom in on this, we think, more reasonable demographic model approach. This is the histogram of carbon loss versus carbon gain by number of project, and this is it by forest area. And the take home here is that if you buy this set of modeling simulations, that about 36% of existing forest offsets we think are likely to lose carbon over the 21st century, to have less carbon at the end of the century than they have today. That is massively higher than all of these protocols, including California's, currently allow for. They have an insurance policy that is not based on any data and does not include these climate risks. I just want to briefly mention, we attempted this kind of multi-data set, multi-model approach at a global scale. And so this is our global set of climate risks that we did. In this case, we can't get all the way to carbon, so we've done it by the average percentile of risks. And there's a huge amount of variation here, but there are some consistent patterns across these data sets where, in particular, you see higher risks in the southern boreal forests, higher risks at drier edges of the Amazon, and lower risks in wetter regions. There are at least some regions where there's signal emerging from the noise in these 7 different data sets. That's the good news. The bad news is this is the global correlation across these 7 different data sets, and there's actually no significant correlations in the spatial patterns across these 7 approaches. These first 2 are the mechanistic models. These are the species distribution or niche models, and then these 2 are more sort of disturbance demography type models. So to wrap up and tie the pieces together, I think increasingly we can start to scale from these tissue level ecophysiological processes up to ecosystem responses. It's challenging, but I think we have more and more tools and data sets to do this. On the second half of my talk, nature-based solutions really urgently need a lot better data and better consideration of these 4 key pieces that I mentioned, these 4 key ingredients. And the climate risks to forests in the West and forests around the globe are really pretty substantial. They're very uncertain, and they're widely underestimated in current policies and protocols. And I think this is really an enormous scientific call to action. So with that, a quick plug for the new center that we've launched, the Wilkes Center for Climate Science and Policy. The goal of the Wilkes Center is really to try to get cutting edge science into the hands of decision makers. So this is some of the goals we have of making these tools useful to managers, to policymakers. And we have 2 events, or 1 set of prizes that's now open. These are open. We have an International Climate Solutions Prize and a 40K Student Innovation Prize. All of these are open. So the International Prize is open to anyone in the world who has ideas about scalable climate solutions. Please check it out. And then this Student Prize, this year we've actually opened it up to all students across Utah colleges, and universities. So please pass this on to your students. We'd love to see some great Utah State submissions to this student prize. All of these have their submission deadline at the end of February. And then finally, we hold this annual summit that this coming year will be May 14th and 15th at the University of Utah. And so this is my invitation to all of you to please come check it out. It's going to be a wide range of climate resilience and climate innovation set of panels and speakers. And we should be getting this up on our website soon about more of the agenda. So with that, huge thanks to my lab, the folks who make this all happen, and thanks to my collaborators and funders.